Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Elizabeth Coleman Center for the Advancement of Public Action. I'm Brian Campion. For those of you watching at home, as I've said in the past, and for those who are logging in now for the first time, we do look very much forward to getting to the point where we can once again all be here together, have tea and cookies and coffee and conversation afterward. But for the time being, we are limiting the number of people that come on and come to campus out of abundance of caution. Getting a little bit of an echo. Here we go. So welcome, those who are here and then those who are watching at home. Last week, we all sat here riveted by Congressman Peter Welch's eyewitness account of the January 6th attack on the Capitol. He spoke of the vile signage, the extreme anger, the deep sadness when 139 Republicans voted against certifying Biden's well-documented victory, rather than follow democratic tradition of accepting the results of an election. Tonight, we continue our search and examination of the cultural, historical, and political events that led to that infamous day. We want to know how we got here, how to strengthen our democracy, and how to teach January 6th to students across the country. And tonight, we couldn't have anyone better to help us with our work than Professor Randall Balmer. There is so much I could say about Professor Balmer and his incredible contributions to American society, but instead, I want to give you a taste of the kind of talent we have the opportunity to engage. In 2004, Professor Balmer, Professor, am I pronouncing your last name correctly? I'm sorry. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly? Yes. Great, great. In 2014, Professor Balmer turned much of our thinking, certainly mine, about politics and the religious right on its head when he wrote, "One of the most durable myths in recent history is that the religious right emerged as a political movement in response to the U.S. Supreme Court's 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling legalizing abortion. But the abortion myth quickly collapses under historical scrutiny. In fact, it wasn't until 1979, full 6 years after Roe, that evangelical leaders, at the behest of a conservative activist, seized on abortion not for moral reasons, but as a rallying cry to deny President Jimmy Carter a second term. Why? Because the anti-abortion crusade was more palatable than the religious right's real motive, protecting segregated schools. Professor Randall Balmer holds the John Phillips Chair in Religion at Dartmouth, earned a PhD from Princeton University in 1985, and taught as Professor of American Religious History at Columbia University for 27 years before going to Dartmouth in 2012. Dr. Balmer has published widely in both scholarly journals and in the popular press. Among his many books and articles is The Redeemer, The Life of Jimmy Carter. It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome Professor Balmer to Bennington College. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I confess that even though my family and I have been coming up to Vermont since at least the early 1990s, this is my first visit to Bennington College. And I apologize for that. I wish I had come earlier. It's a lovely place, and I'm delighted to be here. So thank you very much for this invitation. As some of you noted from the January 6th attack on the Capitol by what some people are calling domestic terrorists, a lot of those domestic terrorists were carrying crosses or other religious symbols. Some of them explicitly invoked the name of Jesus for their attack on the Capitol and arguably their attack on democracy. And like you, I was a bit puzzled by that. And so I'm hoping today to shed a little bit of light of that. And I will be referencing a stunning new book that just appeared a month ago called Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. And it's by me, actually. It's a very slim volume, intentionally so. And I want to talk a little bit about that to try to help explain why we came to that point on January 6th, 2021, with the attack on the Capitol. Let's begin quickly with a definition. What is an evangelical? I use a three-part definition, Trinitarian, by the way. Three-part definition. An evangelical is somebody who takes the Bible very seriously as God's revelation to humanity. And so the impulse is to interpret it literally. Although evangelicals, like other believers, I have to say, engage in what I call the ruse of selective literalism when they approach the Bible. Second part of that definition is to say that evangelicals believe in the centrality of a conversion or a born-again experience. And this comes from the New Testament, the 3rd chapter of St. John, when Nicodemus, a Jewish leader, visits Jesus by night to ask Jesus how he, Nicodemus, can enter the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus replies, "You must be born again," or in some translations, born from above. And so evangelicals understand this as a dramatic turning away from a past life, from sin towards salvation, from death to life. To put it in crassest terms, from hell to heaven as an ultimate destiny. And most evangelicals, in fact, would be able to recite the circumstances surrounding their conversions. I was converted on July 17, 1982. I was in the hospital, prepared to go down for surgery. My roommate asked to read the Bible with me, and I gave my heart to Jesus. I became born again. I was saved. Those are all synonymous terms. So very often it is a datable experience for evangelicals when they can point to turning away from an old life to embrace a new and different life. And the third part of the definition is to say that evangelicals believe in the importance of what Christians call the Great Commission in the New Testament. That is, the injunction on the part of Jesus toward his disciples to go into all the world, preach the gospel, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So the impulse to evangelize, to bring others into the faith, is part of what it means to be an evangelical. So a three-part definition: the Bible is God's revelation to humanity, the centrality of conversion experience, and the impulse to evangelize or to bring others into the faith. And just to give you a sense of numbers, again, it's very hard to pin this down because polling data are very vague on these questions, but I would say the range is anywhere from 25 to 46% of the U.S. population would fit that definition. I think it's a fair assumption to say that roughly 1/3 of Americans would fit in that definition of evangelical. So it's a vast movement, but it's also an internally diverse movement. You have a lot of different strains within that larger umbrella of evangelicalism. So, for example, you have fundamentalists, you have Pentecostals, you have a growing number of Latino, Latina, Latinx folks who are part of this movement. You also have the Black evangelical tradition. You also have, say, the Southern Baptist Convention. Southern Baptists don't like the term evangelical, but I think it's appropriate at some point to apply what I call the duck test. Right? It walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. It's probably a duck. In the case of Southern Baptists, they would fit into that definition as well. And there are other different strains we could talk about. I don't want to be derailed by that conversation about definition. But roughly, again, 1/3 of the population, I think it's safe to say, would fit into that definition. Well, let's look a little bit about the history of this movement. First of all, if you go way back to the 19th century, particularly the decades straddling the turn of the 19th century, you have what historians call the Second Great Awakening. That is a huge revival of religion that convulses the new nation in 3 different theaters. Here I am, three is a motif, it seems tonight. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that, but nevertheless. 3 different theaters. The first theater was in New England, when particularly graduates of Yale Divinity School, or Yale College as it was known at the time, began to fan out across New England and bring a revival, rejuvenation of faith and piety around New England. And I've read accounts from this period, places like even Hanover, New Hampshire, having a religious revival occurring during this Second Great Awakening. The second theater of that Second Great Awakening was in the Cumberland Valley of Kentucky, the area that was convulsed with the so-called Great Revival. This is the area of a great deal of enthusiasm, people lying on the ground in various paroxysms of response to the Holy Spirit under the influence of revival. Quite an ecstatic and enthusiastic embrace of the gospel. And the third theater of the Second Great Awakening took place a little bit later, roughly in the 1830s, in upstate New York, an area that was so often, so frequently singed with revival fires that it became known as the burned over district, when revival of religion was taking place in an area that had only recently been opened for settlement by the construction of the Erie Canal, which was concluded in 1825. Well, it's particularly that last theater, that last iteration of the Second Great Awakening that really established the evangelical social ethic, which really in many ways set the terms for social reform for much of the 19th century. And if you look at the way evangelicals understood their obligation to the world, to society, they sought to reform society according to the norms of godliness. And so they engaged in all sorts of reform activities. Public education, known as common schools in the 19th century, was very much an evangelical cause in the 19th century. Because evangelicals recognized that, especially for the children of those who were less affluent, the way for them to become upwardly mobile was to be educated. And so there's a lot of explicit references in the 19th century, particularly in the antebellum period, to the importance of education, particularly public education or common schools. Peace crusades were very common in the antebellum period as well. They pretty much disappeared with the onset of the Civil War, but in the early decades of the 19th century, evangelicals were very much involved in peace crusades. I've even run across an instance of an evangelical campaign for gun control in the early part of the 19th century. Prison reform was an evangelical cause in the early part of the 19th century. The abolition of slavery, obviously we're talking about the North. There were Southern defenders, evangelical defenders of slavery. I'm not going to deny that. That was certainly not the case. But in the North, evangelicals banded together to end the scourge of slavery. And, very notably, women's rights, women's equality, including voting rights for women, which at that time was considered a rather radical notion in the early part of the 19th century. So the overall picture that emerges from evangelical social activism in the 19th, but even into the early 20th century, is that evangelicals were very much concerned with those on the margins of society. They were very much concerned to assist the fortunes of those who were less fortunate. Now, again, I'm going to add the caveat here that not all of these efforts would pass muster today. That is to say that some of these efforts were rather paternalistic or even colonialist. But if you look at the overall record of evangelical social activism in the 19th century, and you plotted it along a contemporary political spectrum, there's no question whatsoever that it would lean very heavily toward the left of the political spectrum. What happened? Well, I don't probably have time to get into all of the details, but let me jump ahead to the middle decades of the 20th century. What happens in the 20th century is that, beginning at least symbolically, and I don't want to pin too much significance on this, but the Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee in July of 1925 was an important event because evangelicals began to understand that they were themselves rather marginal in the larger society, at least as they understood it. Scopes trial, as you remember, was when John Thomas Scopes in Dayton, Tennessee was placed on trial for violating the state's Butler Act, which forbade the teaching of evolution in public schools. And so Clarence Darrow defended John Thomas Scopes. William Jennings Bryan, a very famous evangelical leader and three-time Democratic nominee for president, assisted the prosecution in the Rea County Courthouse in Dayton, Tennessee. And the upshot of that trial was that Bryan and evangelicals were ridiculed in the public square for being anti-science, being somehow retrograde and so forth. Not a really fair characterization, to be honest, although we have to say that William Jennings Bryan did not exactly acquit himself very well in that trial. The effect of that was for evangelicals to withdraw from the larger society and to hunker down in what I call the evangelical subculture, which is a vast and interlocking network of congregations, denominations, publishing houses, missionary societies, Bible camps, Bible institutes, seminaries, all of that as a way to separate themselves from the larger world, so that it was possible in the middle decades of the 20th century to grow up within that evangelical subculture, and I can attest to this personally, to grow up within that subculture and have very little commerce with those outside of that world. It was a defensive posture on the part of evangelicals. And politically, that meant that evangelicals were not engaged in politics, certainly not in any organized way, through the middle decades of the 20th century. That begins to change in the 1970s. And it changes in particular because the governor of Georgia, a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher, decides to mount a campaign for President of the United States. And everybody just dismissed this guy, Jimmy Carter, as being an also-ran before the campaign even started. But Jimmy Carter was very tenacious. As Brian indicated, one of my books is a biography of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, when he sets his mind on something, very often succeeds. He was a very tenacious campaigner, particularly in the precincts of New Hampshire and in Iowa, where he began to make his mark as a candidate for the Democratic nomination for the 1976 presidency. And of course, Jimmy Carter emerges triumphant out of the primary process and then is elected president in 1976. This caught the attention of evangelicals. Here we have somebody who is being taken seriously as a candidate for president, who declares openly that he's a born-again Christian. This is code language that is resonating with a lot of evangelicals at that time. And what was even more remarkable, and again, I remember this very clearly, what was even more remarkable is that he was not abashed about it. He was willing to talk about his faith, and he did so freely and openly, and with anybody who asked him any questions about that. That caught the attention of evangelicals, and even though they were not organized politically, many evangelicals in 1976 took that opportunity to vote for one of their own as President of the United States in 1976. Jimmy Carter, as you know, squeaked toward the presidency in 1976. He was headed for a landslide, actually, but in September, the November issue of Playboy magazine hit the newsstands. This is the interview, the famous interview where Jimmy Carter said that he had looked at women other than his wife with lust. And the media had a field day with it. I remember when the editorial cartoons depicted Jimmy Carter looking at the Statue of Liberty and the state of undress and so forth. It just went crazy. Jimmy Carter lost 15% in the polls because of that Playboy interview, even though what he said is utterly unremarkable for evangelicals. What did Jesus say in the Sermon on the Mount? Jesus said, if you've heard it said, if you kill your brother, you have violated the law. I tell you, if you hate your brother, it's as though you killed him. You've heard it said that you should not commit adultery. But I tell you, if you look on someone else with lust, it's as though you committed adultery. So it was an utterly unremarkable statement for Carter to make. But the media piled on, and he barely squeaked the presidency in 1976. Well, what happened? As you probably know from your study of American history, in 1980, when Jimmy Carter was running for re-election, he was defeated by Ronald Reagan with the help of the new political movement known rather loosely as the religious right, or some people call it Christian right or New Christian right. I prefer the term religious right. And how did that movement get started? Well, in the decades since 1980, the leaders of the religious right, people like Jerry Falwell, this would be Jerry Falwell Sr., Pat Robertson, and others, have endlessly repeated the, what I call the abortion myth, that they became interested in politics in the 1970s in order to reverse the moral abomination of the Roe v. Wade decision of January 22nd, 1970. Some of them even went so far as to invoke the moniker New Abolitionists in order to emphasize their solidarity with the 19th century evangelicals who were trying to eliminate the scourge of slavery. It's a wonderful story. It's been repeated endlessly, again and again and again by leaders of the religious right. It is also utter fiction. The religious right did not mobilize in response to the Roe v. Wade decision of January 1973. Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, did not preach his first anti-abortion sermon until February of 1978. That's more than 5 years after the Roe v. Wade decision. In fact, many evangelicals supported the Roe v. Wade decision. They supported the legalization of abortion. Let me give you a couple of examples. In 1968, Christianity Today, the flagship magazine of evangelicalism, conducted a conference with another evangelical group called the Christian Medical Society to discuss the morality surrounding abortion. And here you have a gathering of some of the heavyweight theologians in the evangelical world discussing for several days the morality of abortion. At the end of that meeting, they issued a statement that read in part, whether the performance of an induced abortion is sinful, we are not agreed. But about the necessity of it and permissibility for it under certain circumstances, we are in accord. In 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention, not exactly known as a redoubt of liberalism, passed a resolution calling for the legalization of abortion, which they reaffirmed in 1974, a year after the Roe v. Wade decision, and again in 1976. When the Roe v. Wade decision was handed down, several evangelical leaders, including W.A. Crismo, pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, who had been president of the Southern Baptist Convention, issued a statement applauding the Roe v. Wade decision. Even James Dobson, who later became an implacable foe of abortion, said in 1973, this is the year of the Roe v. Wade decision, that the Bible was silent on the matter of abortion, and therefore it was plausible for an evangelical to believe that a developing embryo or fetus was not regarded as a full human being. This is what I call the abortion myth. Abortion had nothing whatsoever to do with the emergence of the religious right. Well, what was it? Can I go a little longer?
Please, plenty of time. Please. Take your time.
I began to look into this question some time ago. In November of 1990, I was invited to Washington, D.C. with a small group of people meeting in a hotel conference room. And to be honest, I was invited and I was uncertain at the last minute whether I was going to go or not. I had a young family, I had plenty of work to do with my teaching and so forth. But I decided at the last minute to go to this event. Turned out it was a closed-door gathering in a hotel conference room, about 30 people there, all men by the way. And it turned out in the room was a kind of who's who of the religious right, November 1990. I also learned, once I got there, that this was a commemoration of the 10-year anniversary of Ronald Reagan's election to the presidency in November of 1980. Well, I hadn't celebrated 10 years earlier, and I wasn't about to celebrate 10 years later, but here I am, and I thought, well, I'll make the best of this and try to get through it. So who's in the room? Well, Richard Viguerie, who is a conservative direct mail mogul. Ed Dobson, who had been one of Jerry Falwell's surrogates in the religious right, in the Immoral Majority, Jerry Falwell's religious right organization. Donald Wildman, who was the founder of a group called the American Family Association that was targeting television for being unchristian, I guess, the way to put it. Never quite understood. Just turn it off. And he led all sorts of boycotts against the television networks and advertisers and so forth. Carl F. H. Henry, who was the founding editor of Christianity Today magazine, which I mentioned earlier, as the flagship magazine of evangelicalism. Richard Land from the Southern Baptist Convention. Ralph Reed, who was head of Christian Coalition, again, another very important organization within the religious right. And Paul Weyrich. Paul Weyrich was a conservative activist for a long time, and he's really the architect of the religious right. So here I am in this gathering of all these people, and in the first session, Paul Weyrich made a very impassioned speech. He said, let's remember, this movement had nothing whatsoever to do with abortion. What got us interested in politics was defending evangelical institutions against the IRS, because the IRS was coming against us because some of our schools, our institutions, were racially segregated. Almost immediately, Ed Dobson, again, Falwell's surrogate at Moral Majority, concurred with Paul Weyrich's statements. And so at that break, there was a break immediately thereafter before the next session. I went up to Paul Weyrich and I said, I want to make sure I understood you correctly. Abortion had nothing to do. He said, absolutely not. He said, I've been trying since the Goldwater campaign in 1964 to get these people interested in politics. He said, I tried everything. I tried the school prayer issue, I tried the pornography issue, I tried the women's rights issue, I tried abortion. Nothing got their attention until the IRS began coming after these institutions because of their racially segregated character. And that set me on a quest. Consumed more years of my life than I care to tally, frankly, trying to find out and to confirm Paul Weyrich's account of the origins of the religious right. I stand before you tonight without fear of contradiction to say that the origins of the religious right had nothing to do with abortion. It was instead a defense of racial segregation in evangelical institutions. Now, let me give you a bit of specifics here. I've already exceeded my time. And,
oh, no, we're going to be here for an hour and a half, so
okay.
talk as long as you like.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, so what got them interested in politics? Again, let's remember that up until that time, up until the 1970s, evangelicals were not organized politically. I mean, many even, and again, I come out of this world and I remember this very clearly, many were not even registered to vote. They were that apolitical. What got them interested in politics? Well, it was a court decision, but it was not Roe v. Wade in January 1973. It was a lower court decision at the District Court, the District of Columbia, in a case called Green v. Coleman. Now, let's go back and discuss Green v. Coleman. Green v. Coleman emerged primarily out of Holmes County, Mississippi, where in the first year of racial integration in public schools, which had been mandated by the Supreme Court in the Brown decision of May 17, 1954, in the first year of desegregation, the number of white students in the public schools in Holmes County, Mississippi, dropped from over 700 to 28. The second year of desegregation in Holmes County, Mississippi, the number of white students in the public schools dropped to 0. At the same time, 3 so-called segregation academies, that is to say, whites-only schools, sponsored by churches, applied to the Internal Revenue Service for tax-exempt status. A group of parents in Holmes County, Mississippi said, this isn't right. So they filed suit against these schools, and against the IRS for that matter. That case was tried, but another case, it worked its way through the court system, and finally up to the district court for the District of Columbia. And on June 30th, 1971, the district court issued a ruling saying that any organization that engages in racial discrimination or racial segregation is not, by definition, a charitable institution. For that reason, it has no claims on tax-exempt status. And of course, the corollary is that financial contributions to such schools no longer would qualify for tax exemption. That is what got the attention of people like Jerry Falwell, who had his own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia, founded in 1967. And other evangelical leaders. And that is what brought them together to form the basis, to form the movement that we now call the religious right. Abortion had nothing whatsoever to do with the emergence of the religious right. Well, now you're going to ask, I'm anticipating a question, right? How did abortion become a part of the agenda? It was really kind of an accident. What happened is that in advance of the 1978 midterm elections, Paul Weyrich, the man I mentioned earlier, the architect of the religious right, went to the head of the Republican National Committee, a man by the name of Bill Brock. He used to be a senator from Tennessee. He'd been defeated for re-election, and he became head of the Republican National Committee. And Weyrich went to Brock and said, I want some money to organize evangelicals into a voting bloc. And Brock looked at him and said, who are these people? What are you talking about? I'm not going to give you any money for this. And that got Weyrich going, and he vowed to go out and elect some rather improbable people in the 1978 midterm elections. And he focused on 4 Senate races. One in New Hampshire, where Thomas McIntyre was running for re-election. One in Iowa, when a man named Dick Clark, not the band leader, but a different Dick Clark. Actually, you probably don't even know that, right? I'm showing my age here, I'm sorry. Was running for re-election. He was a Democrat, had been elected 6 years earlier with 55% of the vote, was overwhelmingly popular in Iowa. He was running for re-election. And 2 Senate races in Minnesota. One of them was for the unexpired term of Walter Mandel, who was, of course, Jimmy Carter's vice president. And in all 4 of those races, the final weekend of that campaign, pro-lifers, Roman Catholics, because evangelicals regarded abortion as a Catholic issue in the 1970s, leafleted church parking lots. And 2 days later, in an election with a very low turnout, all 4 of those Democratic candidates who were favored by polls and pundits, everybody thought they would be easily elected or re-elected. All 4 of them lost to anti-abortion Republicans. I remember going through Paul Weyrach's papers out at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, of all places, and coming across the correspondence surrounding that midterm election in 1978. It's almost as though the paper started to sizzle, because he realized he finally found an issue that would appeal to grassroots evangelicals. And in the ensuing 2 years, he begins to push this issue among evangelicals, the abortion issue. 3 months after that midterm election of 1978, a film series begins touring the country, produced by a man named Frank Schaeffer, featuring his father, Francis Schaeffer, who is in many ways the intellectual godfather of the religious right, together with a pediatric surgeon from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, named C. Everett. And this film series is called Whatever Happened to the Human Race. And as that film series begins to circulate among evangelicals, finally abortion begins to be part of that conversation. Even so, as late as August of 1980, the Reagan-Bush campaign was not certain that abortion would work for them as a political issue among evangelicals. On August 22nd, 1980, there's a huge rally of evangelicals in Dallas, Texas, at Reunion Arena. And Reagan, this is the event where Reagan famously came to the podium and said, "I know this group can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you and what you're doing." It brought down the House, arguably sealed the election, or sealed the evangelical vote at least, for Ronald Reagan in 1980. I looked through his speech, which is out at Simi, at the Reagan Library, Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. In that speech, he talks about creationism. He said that if you were on a desert island, the one book you would want with him is the Bible. He excoriated the Internal Revenue Service for its pursuit of these evangelical institutions. He did not mention abortion even once in that speech. This is why I call it the abortion myth. Can I go over
Please, you know the floor.
So, how do we get from the origins of the religious right in the 1970s, in defense of racial segregation, in defense of racism, there's no pretty way to say this, to Donald J. Trump in 2016, when 81% of white evangelicals supported Donald Trump, and only a slightly lesser figure supported his re-election in 2020. Actually, in the course of writing this book, I learned something. That is to say, I hope I learned a lot of things, but I learned something in particular here. That is, I think the missing link is Ronald Reagan himself. So how do you connect the racism behind the origins of the religious right and Donald Trump? I don't think there's a whole lot of discussion about Donald Trump's racial views, but I'm happy to have that conversation if you want to have that conversation. And I think the missing link, and this is what came to me in the course of writing this book, was Ronald Reagan. Just as Donald Trump emerged onto the national political scene, questioning the nativity that is the birthplace of Barack Obama, America's first African-American president, Ronald Reagan burst on the political scene in 1964 in opposition to the Rumford Fair Housing Act in California, which sought equal access for everyone, including people of color, obviously, for both rental housing and ability to purchase property. He was an outspoken opponent of both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Throughout his political campaigns, he very frequently invoked the racially charged phrase, law and order, while running for office. And who can forget his vile caricature of these mythical welfare queens, women of color who live the high life on the public door. He was never able to produce any of these welfare queens, but nevertheless, that didn't stop him from frequently invoking these welfare queens. And for me, the clincher was when Ronald Reagan opened his general election campaign in 1980, August 3rd, 1980. He had just won the Republican presidential nomination. He's opening his general election campaign for president of the United States. He could have chosen all sorts of places. He could have chosen a Rust Belt city, Cleveland or Detroit, that was really battered by the economy in the 1970s. He could have chosen his own home state of California, which was very much in play. It was not, at that time, any guarantee that the Democratic nominee would win California, as tends to be the case in recent presidential elections. Instead, he chose, of all places, Philadelphia, Mississippi, the place where 16 summers earlier, members of the Ku Klux Klan, in collusion with the local sheriff's department, abducted, tortured, and killed 3 civil rights workers, 2 Jews and an African American. Reagan stands up at the Neshoba County Fair. Reagan, let's remember, was a master of symbolism. And lest anyone miss his meaning, in that speech, on that occasion, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, he invoked the age-old segregationist battle cry, states' rights. I believe in states' rights. I think the missing link between the origins of the religious right and Donald Trump was Ronald Reagan.
I'm going to hand one of these to you, Professor.
Sure. Okay.
And questions? Okay. We'll kick things off.
Do you think that in 1972, when the Watergate scandal came out, do you think that it was more harmful than the one which happened on January 6th? Because January 6th was influenced by one leader, but in 1972 it was done by the president.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is the greater constitutional crisis, is what you're asking? Oh boy, that's a tough one. Well, I have to say that I never thought I would be nostalgic for Richard Nixon. But something is making me nostalgic for Richard Nixon. And people have argued that Richard Nixon is the last liberal president we've had, because he did a lot of remarkable things. He opened China, of course, although Jimmy Carter is the one who finally sealed that deal. People forget about that. He's responsible for the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency. He was pretty good with Native Americans and so forth. So Richard Nixon, I think we have some reason to be grateful to him. Now, was Watergate a greater constitutional crisis than January 6th? I'll probably leave that to the political scientists to kind of figure out. And the other thing is that history has a way of kind of providing some perspective on things. So I'm not sure I'd want to choose between the two of them, to be honest. But I think it's quite remarkable that you have a mob storming the Capitol trying to overturn, well, they're still trying, I mean, Trump himself and others are still trying to overturn the election that, by all accounts, was fair and executed in an honorable way. That's pretty remarkable, I have to say. Don't make me choose, okay? Sorry. Maybe we should ask, Brian.
Right. No, I'm interested, for now, at least going back to the religion piece, and I'm wondering, if I may, how much is this part of our DNA? In other words, it sounds like the evangelicals were really able to tap into something. People were still tapping into things how are we different than other countries as it relates to that? I guess might be a way to frame it. Does this go back to our Puritan roots, and then we can do, so I'm just wondering if you might say something.
Yeah, I think religion, I've actually published 2 books this year. The first one came out in February, was on church and state, separation of church and state. I think the First Amendment is the best friend that religion has ever had. I'm a devoted fan of the First Amendment, because what the First Amendment did was say that the state is going to prefer no one religious group or another. It's going to support no one religious group or over any other religious groups. And it means that you have a kind of free marketplace for religion, where various religious groups compete against one another for popular followers. Now, this is what keeps me employed. This is what I study, so I'm very grateful for this personally. But I think we have a religious culture here in America that is unmatched really anywhere in the world, because you have this competition. And all these groups are competing with one another. And you have all these religious entrepreneurs, to play out the economic metaphor. Religious entrepreneurs who are competing with one another for popular followers. And again, all American history is littered with them. Charles Madison Finney, Ellen Gould White, the founder of the Seventh-day Adventists, William Miller, who believed that Jesus was returning on October 22nd, 1844. Elijah Muhammad of the Nation of Islam. Joseph Smith and Mormons. I mean, it's a wonderful example of that. You have this free marketplace. And I have to say, just, as a kind of coda to this, well, first of all, 2 things. I think one of the reasons that evangelicalism is so popular is that evangelicals know how to compete in this marketplace. One of the ways that I put it very frequently is that evangelicals speak the idiom of the culture probably better than any other religious group in American history. That is, they know how to pick the right sort of cultural moment. So, for example, back in the First Great Awakening, I referenced the Second Great Awakening in my remarks, but the First Great Awakening was a huge revival of religion that convulsed the Atlantic seaboard in the middle decades of the 18th century. And here you have people like George Whitefield coming and preaching to the masses. Now, George Whitefield had been trained in the London theater, so he understood the importance of dramatic pauses and using his stentorian voice. And in a culture that at that time had no dramatic tradition, no theatrical tradition, he was able to just communicate in ways that nobody else had. Contemporaries said he was so effective, he could bring tears to your eyes simply by saying Mesopotamia. In the 19th century, you have the circuit riders, particularly in the South, going to organize the frontier. Later on, you had the coal porters riding the rail lines. And so, in the 20th century, you have the emergence of the megachurches, for example. I'm skipping over a lot of things here just in the interest of time. But megachurches speaking the language of suburban culture, white suburban culture. So evangelicals have thrived within that marketplace, I think, more than any other group, especially because of the First Amendment, which for me makes it all the more puzzling why you have these various evangelical groups, people like David Barton and even the Southern Baptist Convention, trying to collapse this wall of separation between church and state. Why would you do that? Why would you compromise the First Amendment? The First Amendment is the best friend you've ever had. And I think that goes a long way to explaining the importance of religion in American life. Hello.
Hi. Thank you so much for being here, and it's been an honor to hear you speak.
You're very kind. Thank you.
I wanted to know your opinion on how the evangelical right has approached COVID-19 and how a lot of these groups have advocated for anti-masking and have been anti-vaccine and arguably perpetrated a lot of the rhetoric that led in some capacity to the events that unfolded January 6th.
Yeah.
And I just want to know your opinion on that, what you think the origins are aside from historical anti-vax movement.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not aware of any historical anti-vax movement. I think one of the reasons that there's been such resistance in certain circles to the COVID vaccine is that most Americans today are too young to remember the polio epidemic, when people stood in line to get the polio vaccine so that they wouldn't be affected by that sort of thing. And the anti-vax stuff is just, I don't understand. I mean, the only explanation is that for some reason it's become politicized, and I just, that's just incomprehensible to me, why people would put their own lives in danger in order to make some sort of political point, or to, apparently, to somehow deny President Biden the opportunity to take credit for vanquishing COVID. I mean, that's pretty, what's the expression, cutting off your nose to spite your face, and it seems to me that's what's going on here. But a lot of this rhetoric, as I understand it, is couched in religious liberty, right? Which I think is a red herring. I just don't understand this. And let me try to explain this, my view of this. Let me go back to the 1970s, and then I'll come. Now, I said that it was the defense of racial segregation that got the religious right going. Well, Weyrich was cagey enough. He was a very smart man. He's a very smart man. He was cagey enough to recognize that an out-and-out defense of racial segregation was not going to cut even in the late 1970s. And so what he and Falwell did very, very cleverly, it's both audacious and mendacious, frankly. What they did was to shift it to say, our religious freedom is being compromised by the Internal Revenue Service. Very similar to what you're hearing, like the Hobby Lobby decision about contraception and so forth, all this stuff about religious freedom, and now the religious freedom of coronavirus sort of thing. What they very cleverly failed to acknowledge is that tax exemption, I want to make sure politicians hear this, tax exemption is a form of public subsidy. Yes, right? I don't know the specific situation. Bennington College is a nonprofit organization. You got, what, I think I read on the way down here, 40 acres, beautiful land here, fairly pricey parcel of land here. Bennington College does not pay taxes. Right? Now, some of these schools, I don't know about Bennington, they voluntarily contribute to fire protection and things like that. But they don't have to, because it's tax exempt, just as the churches are. That means that all of the other citizens of Bennington have to pony up a little bit more to pay for Bennington College's fire protection, or police protection, or the parks that make Bennington a nice place to be, right? Tax exemption is a form of public subsidy. So when I hear these churches, these mega churches in particular, bleating about vaccine mandates and so forth, I want to say, well, I have to say, wait a minute. You guys have been living off public subsidy for a very, very long time. Don't you think that you have some sort of reciprocal responsibility to the remainder of the community to be good citizens? It seems to me that would be the gracious approach rather than wailing about religious persecution.
We have, I know, about 55 people watching, so please, if you have questions, put them into the chat, but I'm going to ask Susan Scorbati, who is monitoring that chat, I do want to come back to January 6th and religious connections, but Susan, do you want to shoot a couple questions or a question? We can't hear you, but
Here I am.
there we go.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really an excellent talk, really informative. So we have a couple questions from people online. Do you see, and this could connect to January 6th as well, do you see trends in the younger generation of evangelicals right now? I know you talked about how this is different groups. So you can't necessarily lump everybody into the one kind of evangelical,
No, I understand.
right, group. But in general, are you seeing trends in younger people who are evangelicals? Are they anti-science? Is racism something that is being discussed among these groups, particularly since you're highlighting, the origins? Is this commonly discussed or not something among the younger generation of evangelicals?
It's a great question. Thank you for that question. Actually, I have a interview published in the Washington Post today about this stunning book that really should be read. And I addressed that question by saying that I think if there's any hope for this movement, for the future of this movement, it lies with the younger generation. And I think the younger generation, I don't claim to be on top of polling data and things like that, because I don't really follow it all that closely, to be honest. But I think there's some evidence that a younger generation of evangelicals, first of all, they are not anti-science. And one of the issues that has gotten them motivated and energized over the last several years is climate change. They understand that they are going to be living in this world a lot longer than people like Franklin Graham and Jerry Falwell Jr. or whoever it might be. And so they are concerned about this sort of thing. They also are, in my judgment, at least, again, anecdotally more than anything else, and I don't claim otherwise, they are not energized by the abortion issue, for example. Not so much even the issue of sexual identity and sexual preference. That just doesn't seem to be an issue for them. So I think if there's any hope for this movement, I think it's going to come from the younger generation. There's a whole movement out there that calls itself ex-evangelical. It's rather a little too cute in my judgment. Nevertheless, there's people who grew up within this tradition who are now distancing themselves from it because they don't buy the politics of their parents. Now, how large that group is, I really can't say, and I'm not sure anybody can. Frankly, it's just sort of anecdotal evidence that I can back up a little bit.
I'm wondering, do evangelical leaders today, would you say they believe what they're preaching? I mean, climate, anti-LGBTQ, or is this really money and power?
Oh, boy. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I guess I tend to take people at face value and to say, if they say something, I tend to believe it. But I'm maybe hopelessly naive about that sort of thing. Franklin Graham, does he believe? Probably does. That's unfortunate. And by the way, if I may, about Franklin Graham, his father, of course, was Billy Graham. My students don't know that name, but his father was probably the most, well, certainly, absolutely the most famous evangelical of the 20th century. And let me read what he wrote, or what he said in 1980, which of course is the year that Ronald Reagan was elected. Billy Graham, Franklin's father, said, "I don't want to see religious bigotry in any form. It would disturb me if there was a wedding between the religious fundamentalists and the political right. The hard right has no interest in religion except to manipulate it." Quite a remarkable statement from Billy Graham. I wish his son would read it.
So before I pass the mic, I'm just wondering, on January 6th, were there people there that you believe that were following what they believed to be religious motivation? They're there for God, they're there for Donald Trump, and was there a real connection as we're digging into some of these issues?
My guess is that they were. Yeah, again, we're kind of asking to dive into individual motivations, and I'm not sure I'm comfortable doing that, but they claim to be, yes. I mean, this Josh Hawley guy, or Ted Cruz, I mean, you go through these I mean, does Ted Cruz really believe everything he says? He might.
Yeah.
And it's kind of scary actually to think about what he's saying.
So in the European context, the opportunist use of religion has been connected to anti-immigration. And so in the American context, the politicization of religion serves or has served as a tool of mobilization. So my question is, with Proud Boys and evidently January 6th, do you think that America is moving towards using religion as an instrument of anti-immigration?
Oh, sure, I think some people are. There's no question about that, yes. Yeah, and again, I talked about evangelicalism in the 19th century and what evangelicals were doing in the 19th century. But, the other point of guidance for contemporary evangelicals, because of their ostensible adherence to the Bible, is the Bible itself, particularly the New Testament. And Jesus tells us to welcome the stranger. It's in the Hebrew Bible as well, but certainly in the New Testament also. Jesus tells us all sorts of things, to care for the least of these, to visit prisoners in prison, to care for widows, and to care for the hungry, to clothe the naked, and so forth. I would think that would be part of any sort of political agenda on the part of evangelicals, those who claim to take their marching orders directly from the Bible. But frankly, I see precious little evidence of that.
Susan, did you have another question online?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
And this is a little similar to what, Brian, I think you brought up. Someone was asking, what did you make of the Christian religious symbolism on January 6th?
I think it's
Do you think, did that reflect, like you said, you can't go into the minds of people knowing, what they believe, but why is the symbolism being used right now? Like how, if Billy Graham was really warning people of this merging of the political right with the religious evangelicals, what has occurred to really make this thing, merge right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's kind of a deadening sensibilities on that in that respect. And the use of those religious symbols, to me, is blasphemy. And I say this as a person of faith, by the way. I'm not, I'm not a secularist. My faith is very, very important to me, and to see the symbols associated with my faith being used in such tawdry and inappropriate ways is deeply, deeply disturbing to me. Blasphemy, I'm trying to think of a stronger word. Blasphemy is heresy, I suppose, would be even a bit stronger, but no, I think it's an abomination.
Your question? Go ahead.
So I don't know. As you say that you're a person of faith, I think that January 6th and the religious symbolism that was involved with that. That's obviously not the first time that something like this has happened, where especially Christian conservatism has kind of been used to I guess rationalize these really immoral acts.
Right to the Crusades.
Exactly, yeah. So I'm just wondering, do you think that there is a fix to that? Is there a permanent fix that will stop this kind of this cycle?
Great question.
It's a good question. Actually, after this interview appeared today, I got a nice email from somebody who said nice things about the interview, and then he said, we need somebody to write a book about how we can find our way back. And I think that's a good comment, and I spent the rest of the day kind of thinking about that, what sort of book that would look like. But I think, again, I would emphasize two sources. One is the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus, and Jesus is pretty clear. He's even clear about how somebody gets into the kingdom of heaven. He essentially says you've got to have a pass from the poor. You've got to have And you gotta check that box in order to get into the kingdom of heaven. So one thing is taking the words of Jesus very seriously. And I think it's hard for me to see how someone who takes the words of Jesus seriously would mount an assault on the Capitol. And even if you go to Paul, I mean, Paul, in some ways is problematic, I think, for a lot of people, and for me a bit too, but Paul says in Romans 13, talks about the Christian's responsibility, the believer's responsibility to the state and to the obedience to the powers that be. So that would be one source. Again, the second would be, as I mentioned earlier, I think making evangelicals conversant with their own history. And that for me is what, I mean, a historian, so you might expect that, but that for me is what is so powerful. You look back into the 19th century, and again, they didn't always get it right, and I'm not saying they did, but you look at the overall body of work in the 19th century, it's really quite commendable. It's really quite remarkable. And if there was a way to reclaim that and to try to reappropriate that, I think it would have a very, very different political repercussion from what we're seeing today. So is there hope? And one of the things I said in the book is that according to the Gospels, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, even though his body had begun to decay. And if Jesus can do that, Jesus can repair and revive evangelicalism, I think.
Susan.
Another question was, could you explain more about how, I think you mentioned, did Ronald Reagan, what did he have to do, what did his presidency have to do with the abortion myth?
Well, I'm not sure that he had anything directly to do with the abortion myth, but he made all sorts of promises to these leaders of religious right in the early 1980s about passing laws or a constitutional amendment to outlaw abortion and that sort of thing. And actually, coming back to that meeting in Washington in November 1990, one of the real complaints against Reagan on the part of these leaders of religious right is that he didn't prosecute their agenda as vigorously as they thought he would, as vigorously as he gave them reason to think that he would. And so there was a real sense of disappointment. Weyrich, in particular, was quite vocal about this. He said, Reagan got into office, and we went to him with our agenda, what we wanted done, and so forth. And Reagan and his people said, well, no, we need to fix the economy first. We'll come back and we'll get back to your issues later. And according to Weyrich, his sense was that Reagan really never did that.
Liz. Gotta make a new video.
This has been remarkably interesting about a world that we all think we know something about and then keep finding out what we don't know about. But one of the striking things to me about what's happening with religion and ethics is this severance and overwhelming. I mean, among other things, the idea of Donald Trump being exemplary about anything that has to do with ethics is ludicrous.
Family values, right?
I mean, period. So, but that's not always been true to the extent that it seems to be in the 60s, which is another era of great ferment, of course, in this country. There was a profoundly liberal and lively things going on, particularly in the Episcopal Church, that had a powerful effect on the issues raised by the peace movement. Do you see anything in the religious horizon of America right now that has an ethical and humane and civilized agenda that could become a form?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the condensation of that question, I think, is what happened to the religious left, right? Is that sort of what you're asking? Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and there is a religious left, and there's certainly an evangelical left. People like Jim Wallace at Sojourners, who's now retired from Sojourners, but at Georgetown. People like Shane Claiborne or Sharon Harper and so forth. Lisa Sharon Harper, pardon me. I was forgetting her first name. Call her Sharon. So there is a religious left. I think the problem is, particularly going back to the 1980s, is that those people really didn't have their own media empires behind them, the way Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson did. And even Jim Baker. I mean, they were, Jim Baker apparently is back on television doing all sorts of unspeakable things. But they just really didn't have that sort of propulsion into the public square. And, to be honest, those positions that they take, with which I have a great deal of sympathy, they tend to be a bit more nuanced and less susceptible to sloganeering than the kind of rhetoric we see coming out of the religious rights. I think that's part of it. I don't think there's any question that the balance is probably in the direction of the conservatives in terms of numbers and so forth as well. But then we have a kind of chicken and egg issue, which is causing which. But you're absolutely right. 1960s in terms of the anti-war movement in particular, but also the civil rights movement with the National Council of Churches. The National Council of Churches now
Martin Luther King.
is just
That's
I'm sorry, Martin Luther King,
comes
also William Sloane Coffin, and you can go on and on. Abraham, Joshua Heschel, and so forth. You can go on and on about that, and we just don't have those sorts of titanic figures any longer. At least they don't have the same access to the public that the people in the 1960s. The National Council of Churches was a roaring organization up until the mid-1960s, and then it just kind of fizzled out for all sorts of reasons, but that's another conversation.
What does victory look like, before I pass it, to the victory? What does victory look like to evangelicals?
Oh, yeah.
Do you think, what does a society look like that where they want, they're not talking about the conservative evangelicals at this point.
No.
Because parts of it seems, some parts have perhaps been lost. Perhaps they're going to still push, but
Yeah.
I feel like on some issues they have lost.
They have lost, and I think that's one of the reasons that they're so mobilized. And a shorthand explanation for the religious right, very shorthand, is that these are people who felt as though their hegemonic hold on American society was slipping away, and they were right about that. In many ways, they were right about that. Their influence is still quite powerful, but they felt as though larger society was moving away from their values, and arguably it begins with the Second Revolution, the FDA approval of the pill in 1960. That's a huge event. It unleashes the Second Revolution of the 1960s, and a lot of evangelicals are not comfortable with that sort of thing. So they begin to kind of, first of all, they try to ignore it, and then by the 1970s, late 1970s, they begin to kind of try to rally against that. And more recently, of course, it's same-sex marriage and that sort of thing. What does victory look like? I think the next thing on the horizon, and I kind of shudder to say this, is the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And I think in the short run, there's going to be great celebration on the part of these people. By the way, I don't question, I talked about the real origin of the religious right. I don't question the sincerity of the people who are pro-life. I think many of the people are quite sincere about that and opposed to abortion. But if that happens, I think there's going to be a very powerful backlash, both at the ballot box and probably in the streets as well. And I hope I'm wrong about that, but I think that's probably.
Thank you for coming and speaking. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
My question is, what form will evangelicalism take with younger generations, and do you think it would take that subtler form that it had before its mobilization into politics?
It's a great question.
It's got a good question.
I usually beg off such questions by saying, I'm a historian, not a prognosticator, but I'll take a stab at it anyway. And maybe this is wishful thinking on my part. What I would like that to look like would be a more full-orbed addressing of the issues. One of the things that was striking to me, I think, is beginning as early as the election of Barack Obama in 2008. What I was picking up from the younger generation at that time of evangelicals is that whereas people like at that time James Dobson and Chuck Colson were saying the only important issues are same-sex marriage and abortion, right? And they said that explicitly. That was their message. And what I was picking up at that time was the younger generation was saying, wait a minute, we see a whole spectrum of issues that we think are moral issues, including climate change, and that's a big one, I think, for this younger generation. But also at that time, torture under the Bush administration, poverty, hunger, AIDS, those sorts of things were important as well. So I guess I have difficulty kind of dissociating my wishes from what I think is going to happen, but I would like to see a much broader spectrum of issues that could be addressed as moral issues. Good question. Yes, please.
Wait, is this it? Okay. Well, okay. I'm sorry, I just lost it. You were kind of talking about Reagan, and specific examples of how he was playing for the far right. And I was wondering if you had any examples specific to Trump of what has worked. And I was also wondering if you could think of anything that he's done to keep their support.
Keep their support.
Keep their support.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm thinking specifically of that. I'm not religious at all, so I don't have that perspective. So I appreciate yours. But thinking about when they tear gassed a bunch of protesters to clear out the church for a photo with the Bible.
With the Bible upside down, I think. Well, Trump is in many ways a classic demagogue, and I think I'm being descriptive, rather than incendiary by saying that. I mean, he's a classic demagogue. He knows how to rile people up to do what he wants to do. So, for evangelicals in particular, I think what he picked up on was their sense of dislocation and their sense of being marginalized. Now, I think that a lot of that is illusory, frankly, but he picked that up and he was able to kind of amplify their concerns, and that was important to him, or important to them rather. And also the various promises he made about judicial appointments. Essentially, he didn't, as I understand it, he didn't make these appointments himself. He was given a list of people who were considered acceptable to this particular constituency. What's fascinating to me about this is that I think beginning with George W. Bush, you had Republican presidents who were beholden to the religious right for their political fortunes. But very few of the judicial appointments they made were evangelicals. Essentially what they did was to kind of outsource their judicial appointments to conservative Catholics, right? Because and the reason is that there's no real tradition of legal thinking and judicial experience within evangelicals. Now I think it's beginning to start with places like Patrick Henry College and so forth, where they're trying to develop a so-called farm team, and they're quite explicit about doing that. But I think those promises about judicial appointments probably were quite effective. And the fact that he got on board with the abortion issue, even though his own history in that respect is rather checkered, he was able to persuade evangelicals that he would represent their interests in that respect. Do I want to say this? You've got to admire him in some ways. Please don't nobody quotes that actually. But he was really quite deft with scoring political points with that constituency. Strategic, yeah, right, exactly. And I think one of the other thing that he did very well is that he speaks the language of victimization fluently. And that has, and it's always about him, of course, he's the victim, but that for a long time has been a staple in evangelical discourse. You know, we're being persecuted, we're the ones, I mean, you look at the numbers and you say, well, how's that possible? Nevertheless, that's part of the rhetoric. And Fallow was very conversant with that. Robertson and some of these other televangelists in particular were always talking about being victimized. Franklin Graham, Tony Perkins, you go through the list. They're very, very good at that. And I think that's one of the reasons that they gravitated to Trump, is that he too spoke the language of victimization. They identified with that.
Sam.
Yes, sir.
So you mentioned that 1/3 of the American population is evangelical.
Mhm.
And so what do you think the Republican Party might look like without the evangelical movement? Do you think they can even exist at all?
No, I don't. I think since 1980, the religious right has become the essential constituent of the Republican Party, much the way that labor unions once were the spine of the Democratic Party. And now we know what's happened to labor unions in recent decades. And so you can understand why the Democrats are really playing from a disadvantage because of that. But yeah, I think there's no question about it. And I began to see that actually in 1988. I wrote a book that you were very kind to mention earlier, My Eyes Have Seen the Glory, which was kind of a travelogue into evangelical America. I went to a camp meeting down in Florida. I went to all over the country, Dallas Theological Seminary, and wrote chapters in each place. But one of the chapters was going to Iowa for the Iowa precinct caucuses in 1988. And then I came actually to New Hampshire the following week for the first primary of that season. And what I saw very clearly in 1988 in the Iowa precinct caucus, I worked the one in West Des Moines, was a real division between what I call the country club Republicans and the religious right Republicans. And there was a great deal of resentment on the part of the country club Republicans that these religious right people were coming in and essentially taking over their party. Well, I think they have. I think they have for all intents and purposes. And so that has meant some displacement from these other folks. But still, as the political reporter for the Des Moines Register told me a long time ago, he said, if you are hoping to get a Republican nomination for any office in this state, you have to be anti-abortion, for example. You have to kind of go down the line with the agenda of the religious right. If you have any prayer, pardon my saying that, of being nominated, much less elected.
So I think that's going to lead to perhaps our final question as we're getting close to the end here, and that is, you mentioned that there have been presidencies that have been beholden to the religious right, and politicians are, in different states, beholden to the religious right. How do we break that? How do we stop that? How do you have, I'm not saying secular America, but I'm saying a moderated, religious, secular America be beholden, perhaps, or the president and politicians be beholden. Because even in my lifetime, having watched, I don't recall, and I could be wrong, I was 10 when Reagan was elected, but I don't remember people talking about presidents and candidates being asked specific questions about their faith. It was more, even when I was a boy, a private issue. It wasn't, and now it's front and center in a lot of debates throughout the United States.
It is, yeah, and actually I wrote a book about it called God in the White House, How Faith Shaped the Presidency from John F. Kennedy to George W. Bush. And it's fascinating to me because I think, well, I'll do a quick historical story, real quick here. What I argued in this book is that when John Kennedy ran for the presidency in 1960, of course, he was a Roman Catholic, only the second Roman Catholic to be a major party nominee for president. The first was Alfred E. Smith in 1928, and he got shellacked primarily because he was Roman Catholic. As well, but Ku Klux Klan was ramping up in those years as well. And so Kennedy comes along in 1960, and immediately, almost immediately, they go after, the Protestants go after him over about his faith. And by the time I share a quick anecdote about Billy Graham, but I probably don't have time to do that. And
Please, if you'd like, please.
okay.
Yeah.
Quick. When I was doing research for that book up at the Kennedy Library in Boston, I came across a letter from Billy Graham to John F. Kennedy, the Democratic nominee for president. Very kind, gracious letter, as you might expect. And Billy Graham says, there's been a lot of speculation that I intend to raise the so-called religious issue in this campaign. And I'm writing simply to say, I'm not going to do that. I won't raise the religious issue. 8 days later, Graham convened a meeting of American Protestant ministers in Montreux, Switzerland, to strategize about how they could deny Kennedy's election to the presidency. 8 days later. And by the way, he did the same thing with Jimmy Carter, but that's a whole time. I don't have time to get into that story. You got to read the book. The biography of Jimmy Carter. Anyway, so the Kennedy campaign recognizes that they really have to address the issue of his faith. And so he goes to the Rice Hotel in Houston on September 12th, 1960, and delivers his famous address to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association. It's a beautiful address, by the way. You should really look at it. And it's online. You can watch it if you want to. It's in black and white, of course, but it's really quite an amazing address. But the effect of that address is to tell voters to bracket out a candidate's faith when they go into the voting booth. And I call this the Kennedy paradigm of voter indifference to a candidate's faith. And the way I usually test this, and there's going to be some ringers here to be able to answer the question, but here's my question. What was Lyndon Johnson's religious affiliation?
Baptist.
You would think Baptist, yeah, that's not true, but not right, but yeah. My point is just to ask the question. Nobody knows, right? And it's because it was during that time when voters really didn't care. They didn't ask the question. It was disciples of Christ, by the way. That's another story. That changes with Watergate. Right? After Watergate, voters want to know something about the moral compass of their presidential candidates. And is it any surprise that voters chose the Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher who campaigned by saying, I will never knowingly lie to the American people? After Nixon, that was a novel idea, right? That you have a president who's not going to not lie to us. Lyndon Johnson had lied to us about Vietnam. Nixon had lied to us about pretty much everything. And Carter comes along and says, I'm not going to lie to you. So all of a sudden, voters take an interest in the religious life of the presidents. Well, as we got farther away from Carter, that conversation, dimmed in subsequent campaigns. Arguably, it came up again in 2020 after Donald Trump, but that's, again, we need the perspective of history to really understand that. And my problem with that sort of questioning is that religion becomes a shorthand for morality. That is to say, we ask candidates what their religion is as a way of trying to discern whether or not they have a moral compass. It's a bad way to ask that question, because the flawed premise behind that question is that someone who is not religious cannot have a moral compass. Well, that's simply false. A lot of people who are not religious or have no religious affiliation do in fact have a moral compass, right? So it's a bad way to ask that question. So I think we need to find more effective ways to ask that question, or to follow up. So my classic example of that is that the Des Moines Register debate before the 2000 Republican Iowa precinct caucuses, George W. Bush was asked who his favorite political philosopher was. And he famously responded, December 13th, 1999, before the Iowa precinct caucus. He famously replied that Jesus was his favorite political philosopher, right? Now, I don't blame him for that question. I mean, what are you going to say, Machiavelli? It's not a great response, probably, in that context. But what distressed me about that exchange is that nobody followed up on it. Governor Bush, you said that Jesus is your favorite political philosopher. Jesus told his followers to turn the other cheek. How will that affect your conduct as president in the event of, say, an attack on the United States? I mean, that would be a way to follow up on that, rather than just kind of throwing out these sort of empty responses. So we're getting into a whole other conversation, and I apologize for digression.
There's no need to apologize, and I just personally want to thank you. I know our Director of Capital, Elizabeth Coleman, Center for the Advancement of Public Action, Susan Scribati there, would like to thank you, as well as all of us, and those watching from home. I also, if Professor Bummer, if anybody has any additional questions, wants to come down and just say a few words, I think he would be certainly welcome that conversation.